In White Fragility, the author Robin DiAngelo eloquently but forcefully describes a fundamental but historically hidden aspect of our culture. Hidden, that is, to whites. In North America, white people live in a society that is profoundly different and privileged by virtue of their race. Whether or not they feel privileged, white people benefit from this separation and inequality. Given how infrequently white people experience racial discomfort in the society they control and dominate, they need not build up what DiAngelo terms our racial stamina. They bristle at the idea that being white in this society has meaning in any real material way. They believe that only mean, immoral people commit acts of racism, rather than seeing racism as a complex, interconnected system. Many white people feel resentful of people of color, seeing themselves as oppressed by anything resembling affirmative action, believing themselves entitled to and deserving of more than people of color deserve, often unconsciously. They work hard to deny these dynamics and become defensive when they are called out, since they believe that only bad people with intentions to harm others because of their race are racist. White people respond to any intimation that they are participating in racism with indignation. DiAngelo, herself a white person, describes several situations that led her to these conclusions. In diversity training classes or conversations with people of color, white people become argumentative or silent, and they withdraw from stress-inducing situations. All of these responses seek to preserve the status quo by denying that it is really white supremacy, repelling the challenge, restoring white people's racial comfort, and effectively retaining their superiority within the racial hierarchy. The author conceptualizes this process as white fragility. In White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, Robin DiAngelo speaks to white people from the perspective of a white person who recognizes that most white people believe bad people act out racism and not whole societies, that racism is immoral and perpetuated by white supremacists who protest the removal of Confederate statues in places like Charlottesville, Virginia, not by progressive white people like themselves. In fact, DiAngelo argues that it is the white progressives who cause the deepest and most insidious forms of trouble for people of color, especially white progressive women, who may burst into tears at the suggestion that something they just did or said was racially problematic. DiAngelo devotes an entire chapter to white women's tears. Because DiAngelo speaks in terms of her own past and sometimes current unwitting complicity in racism in the United States, her words come across as frank and non-judgmental. If you are white and see yourself as non-racist, however, don't expect coddling. DiAngelo insists that it is impossible for a white person to be exempt from racism, since racism is a society-wide system and not simply an act of discrimination committed by a racist person against a person of color. White people are so steeped in racism, DiAngelo says, that they can't even see that what they take for granted as normal is actually the product of white supremacist ideology and racism. White people are the norm, just people, as opposed to black people or Chinese people. This implies that black people and Chinese people are somehow abnormal, which implies subnormal. Prepare to be challenged. Important concepts. Racial stamina, the capacity of white people to maintain cross-racial honesty by accepting the discomfort associated with frank evaluation and discussion of their internalized superiority and racial privilege. White fragility, common emotional responses white people have when their racial assumptions and behaviors are challenged. They feel singled out, attacked, judged, accused. When they have those feelings, they behave in the following ways: crying, physically leaving, focusing on intentions, arguing. These feelings and behaviors end the discussion on racism and hold the white hierarchy in place. White supremacy, a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined and perceived as white. This system of socio-political power elevates whites as a group. Prejudice, prejudgment about a person based on the social groups to which the person belongs. Prejudice consists of assumptions and feelings we base on little or no experience, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations, which we then project onto everyone from that group. Discrimination, prejudice-based action. These actions include ridicule, ignoring, slander, and violence. If I feel hatred because of my prejudice, an extreme form of discrimination such as violence may occur. Aversive racism. An expression of racism where well-intentioned, educated, and progressive people still benefit from racism and hold subconscious racist views, but don't feel the need to discuss it because they view themselves as already past racism. Good, bad, binary. The idea that only bad people commit acts of racism, which are overt or violent acts directed at individuals, while good people aren't racist at all. Why most white people believe they are not racist. What is a racist? Most white people old enough to remember seeing images on television of black men, women, and children being attacked by police dogs and fire hoses during the civil rights movement in the 1960s believe that true racists are the white people behind those attacks, and not themselves, who would never in a million years treat a black person that way. Racists are bad, immoral people who commit egregious acts of violence against people of color. They are uneducated, ignorant, unenlightened, and, in most cases, Southern. Progressive whites in the North are innocent of racism, the belief holds. Robin DiAngelo begs to differ. In White Fragility, she points out that racism so permeates society in the United States, Canada, and Europe that it is invisible to all but a few white people who embrace anti-racist concepts. How can racism be so prevalent as to be invisible to white people? The answer is complex and multifaceted. First, white people don't see themselves in racial terms. White people are taught not to see themselves as white people, but as just people. Whiteness is normal, the default, and free and innocent of race. Black people and brown people have race as a characteristic. Whenever whiteness is named, white fragility often erupts, with the end result of holding the racial hierarchy in place. Second, white people don't grasp socialization, that a specific cultural lens makes sense of their perceptions and experiences. This cultural lens is neither universal nor objective. It's almost impossible to explore these cultural frameworks because of the key Western ideology of individualism. Individualism tells us that each of us is a unique individual, and that there are no barriers inherent in society to individual success. Failure comes because of character and is not a result of social structures. According to the ideology of individualism, race, along with class and gender, is irrelevant. Social groups simply don't matter. Regardless of their claims that they see everyone as equal, DiAngelo says white people know that to be a man in the dominant culture brings a different experience from being a woman. Being young is different than being old. Rich is different from being poor, etc. And they know that being in one of those groups is better than being in its opposite group. For example, being rich rather than poor, able-bodied rather than disabled. White people get their messages about these groups through television, music, movies, textbooks, jokes, dominant history, and so on. They understand themselves through their comparisons with others. They understand who they are by knowing who they are not. Seeing themselves as unique individuals, white people are unskilled at reflecting on their group memberships and at grappling with the fact that racial group membership matters. It is for these key reasons that racism is so prevalent in the dominant culture. It is invisible to most white people. What do you mean there's no such thing as race? Culture teaches many white people that there are inherent biological and genetic differences between races. These inherent differences account for visual distinctions, such as skin tone, hair texture, and eye shape, and traits such as mathematical ability and athleticism. In reality, DiAngelo states race is a social construct. The differences we see are superficial, emerging as adaptations to geography. Beneath the skin, there is no such thing as a distinct biological race. Despite this, many people of all races hold a deep-seated belief that race and the differences associated with it come from biology. To understand the belief in race as a biology, consider the social and economic factors that motivated thinkers to organize society and its resources along racial lines. Freedom and equality, irrespective of religion or social status, were bold new ideas when the founders established the U.S. and enshrined these values in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. However, the U.S. economy flourished because of the kidnapping and enslavement of African peoples, the displacement and genocide of indigenous people, and the conquest of Mexican territories. It was important to resolve the contrast between the lofty principle of equality and the brutal facts of slavery, genocide, and colonization. Humans excel at justifying ourselves to make sure our sense of self is not violated by our actions or beliefs. For Thomas Jefferson, who owned hundreds of slaves, science provided this resolution. He believed science could prove that black people were inherently inferior, and therefore eliminate the contradiction between our ideals and our actual practices regarding slaves. To this end, the scientists of the day asked why blacks were inferior, rather than if blacks were inferior. Race emerged as a social theory created for legitimizing injustice against minority ethnicities and maintaining the white advantage. In the late 1600s, the term white first appeared in colonial law. The 1790 census asked people to claim their race. By 1825, the degree of blood determined who the government classified as Native American, Indian. The concept of a white race solidified with the arrival of waves of immigrants into the United States from the late 1800s through the early 20th century. You had to be legally classified as white in order to have citizenship, with the rights that citizenship imbued. The courts were now in possession to decide who was white and who was not. Armenians were reclassified as white after a scientist witness declared that they were scientifically Caucasian. The Supreme Court ruled in 1922 that the Japanese were not legally white because they were classified scientifically as Mongoloid. But in 1923, the court ruled that Asian Indians were not legally white, even though they were scientifically classified as Caucasian. The court argued that being white was based on the common understanding of the white man, in order to explain these conflicting decisions. To put it another way, people already identified as white got to decide who was white. We embrace the image of the United States as the great melting pot, in which people from all over the world come together and melt through the assimilation process into one cohesive nation. In reality, in the 19th and 20th centuries, only European immigrants were allowed to melt or assimilate into the dominant culture. Because, irrespective of their ethnic identities, the dominant white culture perceived these immigrants as white, and they could thus belong. The process of assimilation, speaking English, discarding food and customs that set them apart, reaffirmed the idea of American as white. If we look white, we are treated as white in American society. While the whites of the working class suffer classism, they don't also experience racism. DiAngelo states, "I grew up in poverty and felt a deep sense of shame about being poor. But I also always knew that I was white and that it was better to be white." In fact, several studies on income disparity and health show that, all else being equal, people of color suffer worse outcomes than whites with similar backgrounds. Understanding racism as a system. To understand racism, we need to distinguish it from prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is judgment about a person based on the social groups to which the person belongs. Prejudice compromises assumptions and feelings we base on little or no experience, including stereotypes, attitudes, and generalizations, which we then project onto everyone from that group. Prejudice is fundamental to understanding white fragility, because asserting that white people have racial prejudice is tantamount to saying that white people are bad and should be ashamed. They then feel the need to defend their character rather than explore their racial prejudices, which might require changing. Their misunderstanding of prejudice protects it. Discrimination is prejudice-based action. These actions include ridicule, ignoring, slander, and violence. If I feel hatred because of my prejudice, an extreme form of discrimination such as violence may occur. This form of discrimination is readily recognizable. But if I feel something more subtle than hatred, such as mild discomfort, my discrimination will be harder to detect. I may simply avoid interacting with you. This is discrimination. Everyone feels prejudice, and everyone discriminates. When the collective prejudice of a racial group is backed by the might of legal authority and control of society's most important institutions, it becomes racism. Racism is a far-reaching system that operates independently of individual actors' intentions or self-images. Racism is a system, not an event. The system of racism has its origins in ideology. Those big ideas that we're conditioned to accept and not question from birth, that get reinforced throughout society. Ideologies are the configurations of thought through which we are taught to represent, understand, and make sense of social existence. These ideas constantly get reinforced, so they are very difficult to avoid believing or internalizing. Examples of ideology in the United States include meritocracy. Anyone can succeed if they work hard enough. The superiority of democracy as a political system, and capitalism as an economic system, and consumerism as a desirable lifestyle. The racial ideology prevalent in the United States rationalizes racial hierarchies as the product of either genetics, human initiative, or ability arising from a natural order. Those who don't succeed are not as naturally capable, not as deserving, or not as hardworking as those who do. DiAngelo postulates that once we accept our positions in racial hierarchies, they seem natural and are difficult to question, even when we are disadvantaged by them. Both sides will uphold the relationship once the white people and people of color internalize the rationalizations for inequality. Once this happens, she says, society must exert very little pressure to hold people in their places. Racism through the lens of being white. We may think of whiteness as all aspects of being white, aspects that DiAngelo links to the meaning and consequent material benefit of being identified as white in society. Rather than the usual emphasis on how racism hurts people of color, to investigate whiteness means the emphasis is on how racism elevates white people. The meaning of whiteness is based on an underlying premise. The definition of white as the norm for human beings and people of color as a divergence from that norm. White people lack understanding of whiteness in this way, or they fail to acknowledge it. Whites presume the white reference to be universal and impose it on everyone. White people find it very hard to think about whiteness as a particular state of being that could affect one's life and perceptions. White people do not admit to white privilege as the societal norms that produce and maintain it. Therefore, to name whiteness, much less assert that it grants unearned advantage, would be profoundly unsettling and destabilizing, and thus activate the defensive response of white fragility. Another facet of studying racism through the lens of whiteness, says DiAngelo, is looking at white supremacy. Most white people see white supremacists as the evil people tormenting blacks during the civil rights movement, or the self-described alt-right white nationalists protesting the removal of Confederate war memorials. Because of this, most whites become deeply offended when the term white supremacy is used more broadly. White supremacy, according to one race scholar, is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. It calls into existence whites and non-whites, full persons or sub-persons. White supremacy shaped Western political thinking for hundreds of years, though nobody named it. White supremacy as an ideology is invisible. White scholars and activists identify and study other political systems, such as socialism, democracy, and fascism. White supremacy draws much of its power from its invisibility. Scholars define white supremacy as a socio-political economic system of domination, based on racial categories that benefit those defined and perceived as white. This system elevates whites as a group. DiAngelo says that naming white supremacy causes two important changes. It makes the system of white supremacy visible and therefore shifts the focus of change onto white people, where it belongs. Naming white supremacy also enables white people to see that they must recognize their collusion with, investment in, and benefits from systemic racism. In one of American history's great ironies, white people have co-opted a line from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, "I have a dream," to create another way to avoid confronting racism. King's line that one day he might be judged by the content of his character and not by the color of his skin stood out to the white public because the words seemed to provide a simple and immediate solution to racial tensions. Pretend that we do not see race, and racism will end. DiAngelo calls this ideology colorblind racism. If we claim not to see race, there can be no racism. Meanwhile, beneath this surface lay all the ingredients of racist socialization, beliefs and images, and internalized superiority and entitlement. Colorblind ideology makes it all but impossible to address these unconscious beliefs. The idea of colorblindness started as a well-intentioned strategy for interrupting racism, but in practice it denies the existence of racism and therefore holds it in place. Whites who are educated and see themselves as progressive enact a form of racism DiAngelo terms aversive racism. They may tell you that they have lots of friends who are people of color. They may co-opt Dr. King's speech and tell you they judge people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. They then rationalize racial separateness as unfortunate but necessary in order to access the best schools for their children. Claim their workplaces are mostly all white because people of color simply don't apply or qualify. Use racially coded terms like urban, diverse, underprivileged, and good neighborhoods, while avoiding direct racial language. They believe that the inequality between whites and people of color is attributable to causes other than racism. DiAngelo also discusses the feature of white racism called the good-bad binary, which allows whites to avoid confronting racism and further protects the status quo. After the civil rights movement of the 1960s, it was no longer socially acceptable for northern white people to admit their feelings of superiority over black people. Not after they saw the violence perpetrated against black people, including women and children, on television. White people increasingly understood that only bad people were racist. You could not be a good person and act in a racist way. In other words, DiAngelo says, racists were mean, ignorant, old, uneducated, Southern whites. Always Southern. Within this binary, white people feel they've had their characters assassinated when someone like DiAngelo suggests that they are racist. Rather than reflect on their behavior, a white person trapped in this binary expends all their energy to defend their character and deflecting the charge of racism. The good-bad binary makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about what racism is, how it shapes all white people, and the inevitable ways that they are conditioned to participate in racism. The good-bad binary that bad people are racist, that racism is individual intentional acts committed by unkind people, is the underlying cause for white defensiveness on racism. DiAngelo asks if a white person conceptualizes racism as a binary and places themselves on the not racist side, what more is required of them? Nothing more is required, she says. Therefore, racism is not their problem. They refuse to challenge themselves to think critically about racism, nor will they use their position as a member of the dominant culture to challenge racial inequality. Anti-blackness and racial triggers for white people. Anti-blackness is broader than the negative prejudices that white people have absorbed. Anti-blackness is the cornerstone of their very identities as white people. The concept of whiteness has always depended on the concept of blackness. Until the need to justify the enslavement of Africans, we had no conceptualization of race at all, much less a white race. Having a separate and inferior black race created the superior white race. In this sense, white people need black people. Blackness is central to the development of white identity. While others see a form of tribalism writ large, or lingering stereotypes not tied to white guilt, DiAngelo believes the white collective profoundly hates blackness and what it reminds them of, that they are capable and guilty of doing immeasurable harm, and that their gains come from the mistreatment and subjugation of others. They have a special dislike of uppity blacks, those who presume to step up and look white people in the eye as equals. DiAngelo turns to a book called White Rage to talk about the trigger for white indignation. It is not the presence of black people that is so problematic. It is blackness that demands full and equal citizenship, that refuses to accept subjugation. For some, the election of a black man as President of the United States represented the highest advancement and, therefore, the most intolerable affront. DiAngelo asserts that most white people notably lack the full information about what racism is and how it works. For many white people, an elective course taken in college or a required cultural competency training at work is the only instance which may challenge their racial reality. But these courses or workshops rarely talk directly about racism, much less address white privilege. Usually, she says, these programs use racially coded terms such as urban, disadvantaged, or inner city, but rarely use white or privileged. There are reasons for this lack of mention of the dynamics and beneficiaries of racism. The white facilitators don't understand racism themselves. Personal and economic preservation tactics for facilitators of color, and administration pressure to keep the program content comfortable and palatable for whites. If a program actually addresses racism and the privileging of whites, the facilitators must contend with white anger, argumentation, and guilt. Even so-called progressive whites insulate themselves with the claim that they need not engage with the discussion because they already had a class on this, or already know this. These responses make up white fragility, the product of a diminished psychosocial stamina instilled by racial segregation. DiAngelo asserts that despite its being ubiquitous, most white people leave unnamed and may even deny white superiority. If some white people explicitly oppose racism, there are large numbers who do. They often also deny their racially based privileges that reinforce racist oppression and disadvantage for others. This contradiction is problematic. White people's moral outrage at racism increases their inability to acknowledge their complicity with it. When DiAngelo consults with organizations that need her to help them recruit and retain more people of color in their workforce, they regularly warn her that past efforts to solve the problem of diversity resulted in trauma for the white employees. Because of this trauma, business leaders avoid the topic for years at a time, and the organizations have remained overwhelmingly white. When the business leaders ask DiAngelo to come and work with employees in diversity training, she says they caution her to proceed slowly and be careful. Many whites use language of violence to describe anti-racist endeavors. They don't feel safe or are under attack. By using words that connote physical violence, whites tap into the classic tale that people of color, especially African Americans, are dangerous and violent. Whites misrepresent the real direction of anger between whites and others, minimizing this history when they talk about race with people of color. White fragility is a form of bullying, with the white person's anger, argumentation, defensiveness, and outrage functioning in a manner which says, I'm going to make the experience of confronting me so miserable that you'll back off, give up, and never raise the issue of my racism again. White fragility keeps people of color in their place, becoming an insidious and powerful form of white racial control. White fragility and the rules of engagement. When DiAngelo facilitates diversity workshops, she observes that being white herself makes the group of primarily white people much more receptive to her message. She can describe American culture as white supremacist and say that all white people are invested in racism without my fellow white people running from the room or reeling from trauma. As long as the presentation remains abstract, white people are receptive to it. Yet the minute she points out some racially problematic dynamic happening in the room at the moment, white fragility erupts. The white person reacts defensively and angrily withdraws, while the other white people in the group rush in to defend the person and explain what she really meant. The point of DiAngelo's feedback is lost, and the group spends hours repairing the perceived breach. DiAngelo says to herself, "You asked me here to help you see your racism, but by God, I'd better not actually help you see your racism." Aspects of white fragility. First, the common emotional responses white people have when their racial assumptions and behaviors are challenged. They feel singled out, attacked, judged, accused. When they have those feelings, they behave in the following ways: crying, physically leaving, focusing on intentions, arguing. Then the white person makes claims to justify the strong feelings and behaviors. Some claims suggest the person feels falsely accused. Other claims suggest the person feels beyond the discussion, that they already know all this. I feel judged by you. I feel unsafe. Class or gender is their real oppression. I have a problem with your tone. Some of my best friends are people of color. I hired a black person. I have suffered too. DiAngelo names the assumptions that these claims rest on. I'm not racist. Since I'm a good person, I can't be racist. Racism is intentional, therefore, my not having meant to enact racism cancels out the impact of my actions. I'm entitled to feel safe and comfortable, and to have this workshop interaction the way I want to. Finally, DiAngelo names the functions of white fragility. It silences or disrupts the discussion, trivializes the reality of racism in our society, protects white privilege, and blocks the ability to repair a racial breach. According to DiAngelo, because the dominant concept of racism is individual acts of cruelty, it is nearly impossible to have the necessary dialogue with members of her diversity workshops that can lead to self-reflection and change. Outrage often follows the suggestion of racism, followed by righteous indignation about the manner in which the feedback was given. She says the only way to avoid triggering white fragility while giving feedback on a member's problematic racist behavior or statement is not to give it at all. She lists the rules of engagement she's encountered while trying to talk to white people about their racism. 1. Proper tone is crucial. If any emotions creep into the feedback is invalid. 2. We must trust each other. You must trust that I'm in no way racist before you give me feedback on my racism. You must not give me feedback except privately. If you give me feedback in front of others, you've committed a serious social transgression. 3. You must protect me from embarrassment, or the feedback is invalid and you are the transgressor. 4. You have misunderstood my behavior if you say it had a racist impact. You must let me explain myself until you see your misunderstanding. 5. You must acknowledge my good intentions and agree that these good intentions cancel out the harm of my racist behavior. Completely comfortable and safe during a discussion of racism. Since pointing out my racist assumptions or behavior will cause me to feel unsafe, you must rebuild my trust by never giving me feedback again. These rules of engagement obscure racism, protect white privilege and dominance, and restore white comfort and feelings of equilibrium. DiAngelo recognizes that feedback is crucial to discover and repair white people's inevitable and often unaware collusion with racism. Therefore, she created 2 guidelines for receiving racial feedback herself. Understanding that giving racial feedback is difficult, she'll take it any way she can get it. She says, from my position of social culture and institutional white power and privilege, she is perfectly safe and can handle it. If she can't handle it, it's up to her to build her racial stamina. Her second guideline is simply to thank the person giving the feedback. White women's tears. When conducting her diversity workshops, in which there are people of color present, DiAngelo asks white women to either refrain from crying or to leave the room if they must cry. There is a long history of black men being tortured or murdered because of a white woman's tears or distress. And white women bring that history with them into the workshops. This history includes the abduction and murder of a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till, who allegedly flirted with a white woman in a grocery store in 1955. The woman reported the flirtation to her husband, and a few days later he and his half-brother murdered Emmett Till, mutilated his body, and sank it into the Tallahatchie River. An all-white jury acquitted the men, and on her deathbed in 2017, the white woman admitted she had lied and then recanted her story. This murder and its aftermath is just one example of the history that white women bring with them to diversity workshops. It informs an oft-repeated warning from DiAngelo's African American colleagues. When a white woman cries, a black man gets hurt. When a white woman cries over feedback relating to racism, all the attention of the workshop immediately goes to her, demanding time and attention when the workshop attendees should focus on ameliorating racism. The white people yet again abandon or blame the people of color in the room. Where do we go from here? DiAngelo says that only after white people have escaped the good-bad binary and transformed their understanding of what racism is and how it works can they let go of white fragility and challenge their racist assumptions and behaviors. Entirely different feelings may emerge when the white person receives feedback after this transformation. Humility, gratitude, discomfort, compassion. When they have these feelings, they might enact the following behaviors: reflection, apology, seeking clarification, believing. When they have these feelings and behaviors, they might make the following claims: "This is hard, but I appreciate this feedback. I must resist defensiveness and complacency. I was socialized to have this pattern. I want to change it. This is very helpful. Thank you." When white people's fundamental understanding of racism transforms, so will their assumptions and behaviors. DiAngelo asks us to imagine the transformation of our environment, norms, and policies if the following described our assumptions. Being good or bad is irrelevant. Racism is a multifaceted and multi-layered system embedded in our culture. Racism is unavoidable. Everyone is socialized into the system of racism. Bias is unconscious. I expect it to take a lot of ongoing effort to become aware of mine. DiAngelo postulates that these transformed assumptions might interrupt racism in the following ways. 1. Allow white people to grow. 2. Ensure action. 3. Interrupt internalized white superiority. When white people ask DiAngelo what to do about racism and white fragility, she responds with a question of her own. What has enabled you to be a full, educated, professional adult and not know what to do about racism? The information is all around us, she says. People of color have been telling us for years. Next, she says, do whatever it takes to transform your assumptions about racism, and then see how your interpersonal relationships change and how our institutions change. Finally, she offers the following advice. Break with the apathy and complacency of whiteness and take the initiative to find out on your own. What should a white person do when they receive feedback on their racism and their white fragility erupts? DiAngelo advises them to breathe, listen, and reflect. Take time to process their feelings and always return to the situation and people involved. White people, she says, can interrupt their white fragility and build up their capacity to maintain cross-racial honesty by accepting the discomfort associated with frank evaluation and discussion of their internalized superiority and racial privilege. This is racial stamina. Can there be a positive white identity? DiAngelo points out that one approach to anti-racist work involves developing a positive white identity. Many who support this approach also propose that whites establish this positive identity by reclaiming the cultural heritage that they lost during the assimilation into whiteness of European ethnic groups. But this positive white identity is an impossible goal, DiAngelo insists. White identity is essentially racist, she writes. It quickly gets entangled with more overt forms of racism and reinforces white supremacy rather than mitigating it. DiAngelo herself strives to be less white. Being less white means being less racially oppressive. This requires being better educated about racism and to always challenge racial certitude and arrogance. To be less white is to break from white silence and white solidarity, to avoid preferring the comfort of white people over the suffering of racism of people of color, to step beyond shame and move into action. DiAngelo describes the steps she takes while trying to work with other white people on their common white fragility. First, she affirms the other person's perspective before sharing her own. When she does share her perspective, she tries to point the finger at herself, not at the other person. She tells them she can understand why they feel that way, that she has felt that way herself. However, because she's had the opportunity to work with people of color and hear their perspectives, I have come to understand. She then relates her understanding, focusing on how the understanding relates to herself. She has given up ever changing another person. She acts from a commitment to break with solidarity, even when it is uncomfortable to do so. Her own need for integrity drives her, and not a desire to correct or change someone else. How should a person of color navigate white fragility? DiAngelo suggests that if they aren't comfortable pointing out a white person's racism, but don't want to let it go, they should ask a white person whom they trust to do it. Addressing racism is never easy, she says, but a white person can deal with a hostile response to feedback less painfully than a person of color can. To the question, where do we go from here? DiAngelo says white people should never consider their learning finished. That even if confronting all the racism and superiority they've internalized was easy to do, just living within a culture based on white supremacy would enforce the racism all over again. So the process of learning will never end. Taking DiAngelo's arguments means understanding some apparent contradictions which do agree when one digs into them. Race doesn't exist, but it does. That is to say, race is not a predetermined biological difference. In fact, genetic studies show that, percentage-wise, there is more variation between individuals of a particular race than between races themselves. However, centuries ago, the concept of race as a determining factor in one's abilities, mental capabilities, and other social factors came into being. Today, race defines many Americans while the white majority lives in a world without concern for race. The concept of being white is both protected through social norms and denied when called out. The norms of society serve the white majority in creating benefits most don't even realize they have. At the same time, any suggestion that this dynamic exists is met with the assertion that society is colorblind, and whiteness doesn't exist as an identity. Likewise, when people of color assert their racial identity, they often get labeled as the racists. These dynamics serve to keep honest discussions of race, racial privilege, and racial injustice from taking place. It's difficult for white people to talk about race for several reasons. First, the good-bad binary. About racism in American ideology. Most white people believe racists are bad, immoral white people who commit egregious acts of violence against people of color. Racists are deficient in some way. When a person like DiAngelo comes along and suggests that they themselves are racist, they feel like she is assassinating their character. They see themselves as good people, and they erupt with white fragility. That cocktail of outrage and indignation that serves to shut down the conversation and hold white supremacy in its place. Second, the dominant white supremacist culture in the United States is so saturated with racism that racism is all but rendered invisible to white people. White people don't see themselves in racial terms. Society teaches them to see themselves not as white people, but as just people. Black, brown, and yellow people have race. White people are just people. Third, the Western ideology of individualism tells white people that there are no barriers inherent in society to individual success. Failure to succeed comes as a result of the individual's character and is not the result of social structures. Race is irrelevant, so there is no need to discuss it. Only after white people have escaped the good-bad binary and have transformed their understanding of what racism is and how it works will they be empowered to let go of white fragility and start to change their racist assumptions and behaviors. DiAngelo imagines a transformation of our environment, norms, and policies when this new understanding takes place. White people will be able to outgrow and see beyond their limited worldview. They will demand change. They will relinquish their internalized white superiority. DiAngelo aspires to be less racially oppressive. This requires her to break the white silence and white solidarity, to avoid privileging the comfort of white people over the suffering of people of color, to step beyond shame and move into action. She admonishes white people to break with the apathy and complacency of whiteness, and take the initiative to find out on their own what to do about racism. She says that white people should never consider their learning as finished, because even if challenging and vanquishing all the racism and superiority were easy to do, just living with a culture based on white supremacy would reintroduce and reinforce the racism all over again. The process of challenging white fragility and confronting a white supremacist society will never end.